Príjemný dobrý večer, dámy a páni. Príjemný dobrý večer, naši milí televízni diváci alebo internetoví diváci. Sme veľmi radi, že ste tu a ja vás chcem čo najsrdečnejšie privítať. Toto je 5. deň 9. ročníka Bratislavských Hanusových dní, pomerne jedinečného mestského akademického festivalu, ktorý sa nachádza na priesečníku kresťanstva a súčasnej kultúry. Som veľmi rád, že ste tu, či už s nami v sále, alebo aj doma, že ste si nás zapli alebo naladili. Takisto ako sme veľmi radi, že naše pozvanie dnes prijala naša vzácna hostka Sofia Kuby. Ešte predtým, než jej dám slovo, a takisto moderátorovi dnešného večera Jánu Tomaštíkovi, tak by som vám chcel predniesť alebo povedať niekoľko praktických oznamov. Tým prvým z nich je, že témou tohto ročného festivalu je odkiaľ prichádzame. Chceme sa počas tohto týždňa zamýšľať a zaoberať identitou a koreňami našej krajiny. Novinkou je celodenná historická konferencia, ktorá sa uskutoční už zajtra, v stredu 30. septembra. Srdečne vás na ňu pozývame. Príďte si vypočuť názory a vstupy vynikajúcich slovenských historikov, publicistov a intelektuálov. Organizátorom Bratislavských Hanusových dní je spoločenstvo SLH, spoločenstvo Ladislava Hanusa, ktoré je katolickým spoločenstvom, akademickým katolickým spoločenstvom, avšak otvoreným pre všetkých ľudí hľadajúcich pravdu. Ešte stále sa môžete prihlásiť a stať sa členom spoločenstva, prihlásiť sa na formačno-akademický program, ktorý už 32. krát v poradí otvárame už za malú chvíľu. Deadline na prihlasovanie je 4.10., teda ešte to stíhate, môžete aj vy na pravidelnej báze, ak ste v Bratislave, zažívať a zúčastňovať sa podobných diskusí, každý týždeň čítať inšpiratívne texty a posúvať sa dopredu. Chceme veľmi pekne poďakovať hlavným partnerom tohto podujatia. Hlavným partnerom je Fond na podporu umenia, ktorý toto podujatie podporil z verejných zdrojov. Ďalším hlavným partnerom, ktorému rovnako veľmi pekne ďakujeme, je spoločnosť Plaut. Naša veľká vďaka patrí aj našim mediálnym partnerom. Hlavným z nich je konzervatívny denník Postoj. Veľmi pekne ďakujem aj jemu. Do tejto diskusie sa môžete zapojiť aj vy, samozrejme aj vy, milí diváci v sále, obzvlášť sa obraciam na vás, milí diváci doma. Môžete tak urobiť prostredníctvom platformy Slido. Ak si kliknete na www.slido.com a zadáte kód BHD20, tak sa dostanete do miestnosti, kde môžete klásť otázky alebo lajkovať tie, ktoré sa vám páčia. Pozývame vás k zapojeniu sa do dnešnej diskusie. Ak nás sledujete prostredníctvom online prenosu, tak nasledujúca výzva ide tiež špeciálne vám. Chceme vás poprosiť, aby ste zvážili podporu nášho festivalu. Tento livestream je zadarmo, ale ak by ste náhodou mali záujem alebo vám nejakým spôsobom horí srdce pre to, čo robíme, považujete to za správne a hovoríte si, že by bolo vhodné podporiť túto akciu a aj organizátorov, tak prosím, urobte tak zakúpením si virtuálnej vstupenky. Myslím, že všetky potrebné veci vidíte na svojom monitore, či už je to link, na ktorý môžete kliknúť, alebo QR kód, ktorý môžete naskenovať, alebo číslo účtu, na ktoré môžete poslať váš ľubovoľný príspevok. Každému sa veľmi potešíme a už dopredu za všetky príspevky, za každú podporu ďakujeme. Sme veľmi radi, že v súvislosti s podporou môžeme oznámiť aj zľavu pre všetkých ľudí, ktorí nás podporia sumou aspoň 1 euro. Zľava je teda vo vydavateľstve Postoj, je to 10% a vo vydavateľstve Hesperion 20%, takže ak aj takto môžete byť odmenení za vašu štedrosť a za vašu podporu. Myslím, že nasledujúci oznam, a teda posledný oznam z mojej strany nie je až taký aktuálny, pretože kvôli súčasnej situácii v sále môže byť naozaj máličko ľudí a možno práve preto tak hovoríme o tej podpore pre vás doma, v pohodlí vašich domovov, ale pre tých, čo ste v sále, som rád, že máte na sebe rúška, že zachovávate šachovnicové sedenie, teda v tejto chvíli je to celkom jednoduché a prosím vás takisto, aby ste obmedzili a zvážili podávanie rúk alebo iné fyzické kontakty po podujatí. Toto je z mojej strany všetko. V tejto chvíli chcem odovzdať slovo moderátorovi večera. A môžeme, myslím, že potleskom privítať našich oboch hostí.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure that I can welcome and introduce our tonight's guest speaker, Sophia Kuby. Sophia serves as the Director of Strategic Relations and Training at Adf International. Adf International is a faith-based legal organization that protects fundamental freedoms and human dignity at most important international institutions, including United Nations, Council of Europe, European Union, and the European Court of Human Rights. Sophia has been with Adf International since 2015, if I'm correct, when she started the organization's advocacy at the European institutions in Brussels, and she currently serves over the corner in Vienna. And personally, I am delighted to stand here not only as the host of this event, but also as her former colleague for 1 year. During my 1 year at Adf International, I could observe Sophia and draw much inspiration from her work, as she was overseeing major training events, week-long academies on 3 different continents, and continuously traveling the world to connect those who want to live their lives according to their faith. The list of various networks, initiatives, and activities that Sophia either founded, co-founded, or contributed to would be as exhaustive as it would be interesting. However, there's one thing certainly worth saying. These various activities of Sophia Kuby are not a sign of mere activism, but of life deeply rooted in Christ, and of deep desire to see dignity of the human person protected in all its aspects. And I think it's for this reason that today she will not be speaking about any hot topics of public debate for which Adf International might be known to some of you. But the topic of her talk concerns all of us, Christians and others, as much as culture wars. How can we spread the faith where it's considered fairy tale at best, maybe superstition or prejudice or harmful opiate for the masses? And frankly, do we ourselves understand what it means to be a person of faith? Maybe for the coming days of uncertainty of this pandemic, in the days of restrictions on worship and religious practice, but also in the times of some degree of existential fear, this is exactly the type of questions we need to ask. And with this, let me leave the floor to Sophia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ján. Good evening. Allow me to speak in English. I don't speak Slovak, unfortunately. Congratulations to those courageous souls here in this room in times of pandemic. It's good that the light is so strong, because it makes me forget for 45 minutes or so that we are actually in a pandemic, because I can't really see you. So, of course, welcome to those who are online with us. Now, the title, Spreading Faith in a Faithless Society. We could also call it, and actually Ján and I went a little bit back and forth on how we should actually call the session. And there were a number of options out there. And so one was Christian truth in an age of unbelief, or how to talk, which actually is what Ján just translated, how to talk about faith, where it's considered a fairy tale. I would first start by questioning the assumption in the title, in all the titles. Do we actually live in a faithless society? I think that's a fair question we can make. Do we actually live in an age of unbelief? After all, we have churches open in normal times everywhere. We have religious activities, etc. I will break my conclusion to you right away. If we mean to faith by faithless or by unbelief the Christian faith, I think that there is no doubt that in the Western world we are in an increasingly de-Christianized world, society, and we will look a little bit more into this, what that means. That does not necessarily mean numbers, black and white on paper, of how many people have been baptized. But in how we think, how our minds are formed, we are, and I'm happy to receive any questions on this afterwards, but I think we can safely say that we are in an increasingly de-Christianized world. But if we understand by faithless or unbelief, a situation where we have no firm convictions about the basic questions of human existence, I think we can safely argue that these are not disappearing, but rather dominating our world like never before. The question is not whether or not we live by faith. The question is what this faith is. The question is not whether or not we live according to dogmas of a belief system. The question is what this belief system says about our most fundamental questions of existence. So, the title of this talk, and actually our real question today, should rather be how to make the case for Christianity in a culture of competing worldviews, each one with its beliefs, its dogmas, its behavioral rules or codes, its prohibitions, etc. I don't know if you're familiar with N.T. Wright. I recommend him warmly. His books, he's a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at St. Andrews in Scotland. And he says the most important question a Christian can ask today is, what time is it? What time is it? Now, the answer to this, and the question is not meant in the sense like, now it's, I think, 6:10. But what is the particular cultural moment we live in? Many Christians ask today, how can we make sense of our culture? How can we make sense of this, what we see around us? With all the cultural decline we are also seeing around us. What should we do? What is the reason for hope today? Or worse, is there any reason for hope today? If we can't make sense of the moment we live in, how can we possibly talk about how this all fits together in our faith? And about our conviction that we are on a road not of destruction, but ultimately of victory in Christ. Now, of course, it is nowhere said, and our promise is not that this will be cultural victory, that this will be political victory, that this will be legal victory, or any other victory of a worldly category. The victory will be God's victory, and it will be a cosmic victory of good over evil. It will be the restoration of God's good plan for creation. So, for Christians, there are no random moments in history. It doesn't exist. There is not such a thing as a parenthesis in history, one that we would probably better have skipped. Our cultural moment today is one precise, unique moment in the history of salvation. Ask yourself, do you believe that this very moment, with all its godlessness, with all its suffering, with all its violence, if you just turn on the news in the evening, you will see a lot of this, with all its sin. Do you believe that this is fully and entirely in God's plan? And if you do, our culture, our moment, catechizes us. And I want to make a reference to a person I greatly learned from, John Stonestreet, who leads a think tank in the US that is called Colson Center, and he really teaches that idea that our current culture catechizes us. It teaches us something about the great story that we are in. We cannot possibly make sense of the moment if we don't see it as a moment in a greater story. And it's not just any story, but it's the great story of the beginning of the end, and actually of everything in between. The moment is what God has called us to, and everyone personally, and as a generation. But the story is not up for grasps. We live in one particular moment in the great story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Okay, you may say, but what about our culture today? Well, I think there is no question about the fact that our culture is undergoing or has undergone a deep moral shift. Things that just a few decades ago we considered wrong are now right, things we considered right are now wrong. And I think there is no question that there has been a moral shift, but that it's more the fruit than the root of the issue. It is the outcome of something much deeper going on. The moral shift is evidence of a much deeper shift. What we have undergone is a shift in our understanding of reality itself, in our understanding of what is actually out there, what is actually existing. The deepest shift is, I think, about what the human being actually is. Who are we as human beings? The deepest question today really is, and it wasn't the same question at every epoch, it wasn't the same question for every generation, but today the deepest question really is, who is man? Who are we? And the moral shift is an inevitable consequence of not knowing anymore who we are and how we are supposed to live well. And so what we see in our culture is first and foremost an anthropological crisis. And modern men, of course, and many public intellectuals have argued this, or have observed this rather. Moral man is in constant crisis. It is first and foremost a crisis of identity. If we don't know what it means to be human, how can we then, Christians, possibly know what it means to be a Christian in a time like this? The great temptation, I think, that Christians have today is that we allow us to be shaped by the moment alone, by this precise cultural situation, rather than by the greater story that we have been given and in which we are placed on purpose, not just by an accident. And if everything we consider to make sense of our time, our calling, our purpose, is the moment right now, if that's all, our theology will change. And we have to be aware of that. Our theology will change. And it is changing in so many circles, including in our churches. And it is, some call it the cultural theology of the moment. And that is the following. We will inevitably misunderstand Christianity at what Rod Dreher, the author of the Benedict option, I think he spoke in this setting already, what Rod Dreher calls moralistic therapeutic deism. So basically moralistic, be nice with each other, with animals, with the environment, and so on. Therapeutic, feel good about yourself. And deism, invite God into your life and into this world whenever you need help. We will adapt our theological truth to what this specific cultural moment is willing to hear and to accept. The fundamental assumption of this cultural theology of the moment is that we can invite God into our world instead of living in God's world. And if we think that, we've really missed the Christian worldview very early on. We've missed it in Genesis. Never has the Christian faith consisted in inviting God into our world, but in understanding our time, our moment, as part of His story with us. We can invite God, of course, into our personal life, and we should do so. But this really means to hand over the steering wheel so that He can lead us in His life. So, as great as this cultural moment is, let's keep in mind that this is just a moment. This is just a moment in a much greater story, but we need to understand the story that frames it. So, what is this moment in the larger story? First of all, we have to understand we cannot possibly understand the story from the moment. So the question is, how do we understand our culture today? How do we understand how this all makes sense? If we only start with the here and now, there's no way we can make sense of this. There's no way we can understand. Not only why and how this all fits in and so on, but also what are we supposed to do? What is our calling in this? What does this mean actually for me personally, for how I should live my life? If you want to know what is really worth fighting for today as a Christian, it is to understand the moment from the story, to have the exact reversed way of understanding our culture. Understand it from the greater story and then make sense of the moment. What does our current culture teach us about creation, about sin, about redemption, about restoration? What does it teach us about these truths? And I think we see in a very, very clear way, and that is a fantastic opportunity of our culture today, how all these realities are so real. This is not really a fairy tale at all. They are playing out in front of our eyes in such a real way. So God has determined us to live in this time and in this place. And He wants us to give an account of our hope in this time and in this place. That means that we can't just outsource that work. We can't just hire it out. We can't just ask the professionals to do this for us. The professionals being our bishops, the churches, the think tanks, the Hanus Fellowship. They are all absolutely needed and necessary, but we can't hire out this work to anyone. It's our mission and our duty to answer that question. It is us here and now who need to be able to give an account to the hope within us, to withstand the idols of our time, etc. It is not for someone else, for all those out there. It is really for us. So the most important question for us in this current culture is, how can we keep the story straight in this particular cultural moment? It's not just our task. Like in this, there's actually nothing original about this. It was the mission of the Jews in exile in Egypt. It was exactly that. What is the big story in all of this? But we are hungry, we don't know how to survive, we are not free, we live by laws that we don't agree to, we can't, and so on and so on. I mean, you know these stories. It's exactly the situation of the Jews in Egypt. Their mission was to keep the story straight, to say, okay, this is how this all fits into the greater story. Otherwise, it's just despair. And we see this, of course, through the biblical stories and through the people of Israel, through the desert, etc. We see that they are constantly tempted by this. Our culture is at best morally indifferent. We live in a culture in which the most profound moral dilemmas are basically addressed by the logic of utilitarianism. We live in a culture that creates a lot of dichotomies. It opposes faith and science, and those, of course, clinging to faith are maligned as bigoted and close to progress. You're all well aware of the different kinds of death. In general, these are all different kinds of death in our current culture as a result of turning our back on God's ways. So I don't think I have to go into great detail here. And it is easy to conclude that the culture war is indeed decided, and we've lost it. And then there are those, and that's, I think, a significant group, even in our churches, who are convinced that it's all not as bad as we may think, or as some think. After all, the world has never been a perfect place. But instead of complaining and worrying, we should be thankful for the unprecedented quality of life that we can enjoy today. Now, I agree that we shouldn't lose really our time complaining all the time, or even ever, and this can actually require significant spiritual discipline, not to sort of fall into a habit of complaining about what goes on today. But neither of these two positions give us an answer to the question of the moment in the story. The first attitude confuses, I think, cultural dominance with Christ's victory. It confuses Christian hope with cultural or just worldly optimism, and inevitably leads to despair as soon as things get difficult. All that counts is culture, and if it declines, we've lost the battle. And of course, when I refer to culture here, I mean it in the wide sense, right? It's including laws, it's including all sorts of, basically the way how we live together in society. I don't mean culture in the sense of going to the theater alone. But that's part of it, of course. This view gets the moment, and maybe quite accurately, by the way, but it doesn't see the greater story. The story that is a trajectory from creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. The story doesn't end with sin, as raging as it may be today. The second attitude is one that fails to understand the story and the moment. Neither is really important or relevant for the one who thinks that all is well as long as I can live a relatively carefree and tranquil life. So, how can we avoid that in this cultural moment that we live in, Christianity is not fading out into irrelevance because it is a fairy tale, basically? I think Christianity is always only a step away at all times from going really quirky, from losing its transforming power if we cut it off of a comprehensive worldview. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the term worldview. What it means is really the theological truth, with S in the plural, the theological truth that we know and understand and have been given, applied to our current culture. Worldview is the sum total of our beliefs about the world. It's the big picture that directs our daily decisions and actions. Christian worldview means that God cares not only about redeeming souls, our own soul and those of others, but also about restoring his creation. He calls us to be agents not only of our personal strive for holiness, but of the transformation of this world. Today, more than ever, people need to see and experience the transformational power of the gospel. Otherwise, it will have just no relevance whatsoever for them. What does it mean to believe in a God who created this world, who actually did a good job at it, who created it good, who keeps caring for it, who sent his Son to save us, and who promises us healing and eternal life? What does it mean for our dignity, our understanding of justice, of freedom, of equality? What does it mean for how we understand and act out love, how we educate our children, how we live our marriages, how we exercise authority, how we work, how we learn, how we die? There is not one square millimeter in our existence that is not impacted by the consequences of a Christian worldview. Just is, by the way, the case for any other worldview. You certainly know the famous phrase, but ideas have consequences, and they are ultimately life or death. So here are the four tenets, main tenets of a Christian worldview. We believe that God has created heavens and earth. We have an explanation for why evil exists in this world, which is sin, and especially original sin. And it's worthwhile to think about this a little bit. Do it at home after this. It's actually quite unique that we have an explanation of why this evil exists and why evil exists in this world. This is an incredibly reassuring and liberating thing to have. And many worldviews don't have an explanation for it. Third, we know that Christ is risen. And then fourth, our cultural moment is not a closed timeline or a circle or anything like that, but it is an arrow pointing towards something. It is one particular moment on a line that goes somewhere. Christ will make all things new. He promised us. The ultimate purpose of the cosmos is restoration. Now, all these 4 points, and that is decisive and crucial, are not just statements of personal faith. It is a statement of public reality. So, when we say Christ is risen, that is true whether someone believes it or not. But do we believe that this is the case? Do we believe that this is the case? If we don't, well then, what is our hope grounded in? So, these are not just personal truths, but they are true for everyone, for all of humanity, whether they believe them or not. Over the past centuries, the secular world has asserted increasingly a dichotomy between science and religion, between fact and value, between objective knowledge or objective reality and subjective feelings, etc. As a result, Christians today often think in these same terms of false dichotomy, allowing our belief system to be reduced to little more than private feelings and experience, completely divorced from an objective reality. The emphasis on a personal relationship with God, by the way, especially as it has happened over the last 4 to 5 decades, has led undoubtedly to a great renewal in the church, and especially in the West, interestingly. And the personal encounter with Christ is, of course, an absolutely important part of our faith. Our challenge today, however, is not to stop there. Because if we do, it prevents us from seeing God's plan for us beyond personal salvation. It prevents us from seeing the story and will reduce our view to just the moment. Genuine Christianity is a way of seeing and comprehending all of reality, not just one part of it, all of reality. And it's seeing and comprehending reality and not just my personal relationship with God, if we ever comprehend it at all, by the way. This is the cultural mandate that has been given to us in Genesis 1. At the very beginning of Revelation, we have been given a cultural mandate. In a time where the great shining promise of the modern man, individual autonomy, is leading to widespread loss of community, of civility, of meaning, we must show the world that Christianity is more than a private belief, more than personal salvation. There is a deep longing for meaning and order in the chaos that inevitably results from freedom divorced from good and evil, from choice divorced from morality. We must show that Christianity is a comprehensive belief system that answers all of humanity's age-old questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Does this life have any meaning or purpose? The so-called culture war today is not the clash, I believe, of Christian worldview with a sort of neutrality or with no worldview. It is a clash of the Christian worldview with all other worldviews. They can have, of course, there are actually not so many out there, but basically the Christian worldview with a materialistic, atheistic worldview. In one of its variations, there are many. It is a clash of belief systems. It is not a clash of belief and non-belief, or belief and disbelief, or unbelief. Man cannot live without a belief system. Man cannot live without adoring a God. This is, by the way, the reason why the Bible if you look at the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, is not at all concerned with atheism. It's basically a non-issue in the Bible. What the Bible is concerned with all the time is idolatry. Giving something the place of God that is not God. But no God is not an issue in the Bible, because I think the Bible was wise enough, Revelation and all the prophets, etc., were wise enough to understand that man cannot live without a God. Even the fiercest atheist doesn't really live without a God. He just makes something else a God, knowingly or unknowingly. And if the belief system is that there is no belief system, then that belief system is called nihilism. There are various ideas and philosophies out there that compete for allegiance in today's world. And while other worldviews offer bits and pieces, of course, of explanation to these great questions of human existence, Christianity really offers, and I invite you to test this out. I mean, this is a mission for a whole life, but Christianity really offers the only viable, rationally defensible answer to all of these questions. Christianity, and one would argue only Christianity, offers a way to understand both the physical and the moral order, a comprehensive worldview that covers all areas of life, of thought, every aspect of reality. And only Christianity really offers a positive way of how to live in line with the real world. And it's so interesting today that, you can maybe accuse Christianity in previous centuries of having been too otherworldly, neglecting what is happening here on earth, neglecting physical realities, neglecting maybe the body, and so on. Today, that same belief, that same faith is saying, actually, you know what? We have a body. And this body actually is an objective reality, and actually it has some meaning. If that is alone, the only statement you make today, you are basically in the middle of the storm of most of the questions we are reading about in the media, and we are maybe concerned about in the education of our children. So, that's the same belief, the same faith, the same worldview that says, actually, no, there is objective reality, and actually, this physical reality is there and has meaning, and we can live in harmony and in line with it. There's one relatively simple way to compare and judge the various worldviews with regards not only to their intellectual consistency, but also to the solutions they offer to real challenges. And any worldview really has to be able to answer these three basic questions. Where did we come from, and who are we? Why is there something, and not rather nothing? Where did we come from, and who are we? Second question, what has gone wrong with this world? Why is there all this suffering, this violence, these wars? Why this broken families? Why is this all out there? Conflict. What has gone wrong with the world? And then thirdly, what can we do to fix it? So you see that a Christian view on these three questions ties very neatly in to creation. We actually have an account of why there is something rather than nothing, and who we are. We have, and of course, as you probably know really well, but Genesis, of course, doesn't give us a scientific report on this, but it gives us a deep meaning and an understanding of the human existence that is just really consistent. We know why there's so much mess out there, because we have, we believe that we turned away from God. We believe that sin is a reality. And what can we do to fix it? Well, actually Christ did it for us. So we know that there's something out there that is called redemption, and that this is a way out of this. The only way out of sin. So you have worldviews that answer some of these questions quite accurately, actually. So, it's not that okay, any other worldview has no answer to these questions. No, that's not true. So if you take, for example, Black Lives Matter, you can, I think, describe Black Lives Matter as a certain worldview. So what they do is they answer probably quite accurately question number 2. What is the problem out there? What has gone wrong? And so I think accusing racism as wrong, as unjust, as incompatible with our basic equality, because they belong to the human family, so there's that fundamental sense of justice, is actually quite right. I think they have quite an accurate analysis of a problem that exists in our world. What they fail to give, of course, is a consistent answer to the first question, well, where did we actually come from? And so what is actually the foundation of that equality that we somehow, perceive in the human family? But it fails to give a consistent answer to this, and therefore also gets the third point wrong. What can we do to fix it? And if you look around the world, what happens there to fix it, it's certainly not a consistent solution to anything, right? But they get partly, they do get something right. So it's really the 3 together that are quite a reliable test for worldview. Don't just single out one. The 3 together will not only allow you to discern worldviews, but to understand how reasonable and solidly grounded in human existence and reality and experience Christianity is. It provides credible, defensible answers. It is a worldview that fits reality. It just fits reality. And it provides a way for how we are to live in the real world, not in an imaginary utopia. Talking about faith where it's considered a fairy tale means making a strong case for Christianity as a comprehensive belief system. This belief system is not random, is not personal taste, it is not irrational, and it is not irrelevant. Because the world was created by an intelligent being rather than by blind chance or accident. It has an intelligible order. We can understand certain structures and certain laws of reality. This is how the world was made. All created life bears in itself a purpose, a telos, if you want to use the Greek word, and a law for its existence. We know that certain laws exist in the physical world, and that if we defy those laws, we possibly pay quite a high price. Ignoring the law of gravity when you're about to walk off a cliff can be quite an unpleasant experience. To defy these laws is ultimately destructive and doesn't allow us to live in harmony with reality. But it's no different with the laws that are put in every creature, from which we can conclude moral laws for human behavior. Just as the law of gravity can produce painful consequences, transgressing moral laws leads inevitably to painful consequences too. So you can pick any example really, but if you pick one that is actually quite fashionable today and quite glamorous, adultery, having an affair, that can be very fashionable and glamorous, and actually the cool people really do that. But it inevitably leads to brokenness, to jealousy, to anger, to tears, to divorce, to jealousy, etc. Inevitably. This understanding of life's laws is what Scripture calls wisdom. A wise person is the one who knows the boundaries and limits and the laws and rhythms of the created order. We are to live out God's truth in the unique historical and cultural conditions of our age. And to engage the world, however, requires that we understand the great ideas that compete for our hearts and for our minds. It is the great ideas that inform the mind, that fire our imagination, that move our heart, and that ultimately also shape our culture. Charles Colson, in his book, How Now Shall We Live, says that history is little more than the recording of the rise and fall of the great ideas, the worldviews, that form our values and move us to act. Let's not be confused, therefore, what the culture war, if you want to employ that word, is really about. We mostly hear about abortion, gender ideology, LGBT rights, sexual education, etc. These are all symptoms. And while we need to, of course, address these challenges and explain our view in the most competent and winsome way, we need to get to the root cause even more urgently. The real struggle is one between the Christian worldview, as I said previously, and the various secular worldviews arrayed against it. This is what we must understand if we want to have any relevance in both evangelizing the world, so proclaiming the good news to people, and in transforming it to reflect the wisdom of the Creator. Harvard scholar Samuel Huntington wrote in his famous article, The Clash of Civilizations, "The world is divided not so much by geographic boundaries as by religious and cultural traditions, by people's most deeply held beliefs, by worldviews." Our moment is not only an increasingly post-Christian one, but it is increasingly post-modernist, which means that our culture is not just resistant to Christian truth claims, but it is resistant to any truth claim. Postmodernism rejects any notion of a universal truth and reduces all ideas to social construction shaped by class, ethnicity, gender, race, of course. Choice is elevated to the ultimate value and the only justification of any action. George Weigel called this the imperial republic of the autonomous self. Now, he was speaking in this context of America, back in the 90s, I believe, was that article. But this is certainly a statement that can be applied to any Western culture today. The imperial republic of the autonomous self. That's our culture. In postmodernism, all viewpoints, all lifestyles, all beliefs and behaviors are regarded as equally valid. This worldview is embraced so heavily that we see, of course, around us, media, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, but also our university campuses, our corporate business world, our governmental institutions, etc., enforce codes of political correctness. Tolerance has become so important that, of course, no exception is tolerated anymore. But if all ideas are equally valid, there's really no idea that is really worth fighting for, that is really worth our allegiance. Nothing is really worth living or dying for. There's a climate of apathy that makes it particularly challenging to witness to the Christian truth. While Christian ideas were met at all times with fierce resistance of some or of many, depending on the time, on the culture, even today, around the world, Christian worldview is met with fierce resistance in many ways, with persecution, but with hostility, for example, or with just fierce objection. Today, I think that the risk is more that the Christian truths are met with bored indifference. If truth doesn't exist anymore, all that's left, and that's a sort of side note I want to make, which would well be worth a talk on its own, but if all that's left is not truth, if truth doesn't exist anymore, all that's left is sheer power. What else would you have left that would legitimize political, cultural, or other power? So, this leads, and we see this again around the world, it leads to new authoritarian systems of government. This indifference today is the result, of course, of a loss of a common language. So key concepts of Christian faith totally lose their meaning because our current culture can't possibly make sense of them. Concepts such as guilt, sin, forgiveness, sacrifice, redemption makes no sense anymore. It is not surprising that people become utterly indifferent to Christianity if these key terms are void words, bar of any meaning for our lives. Who needs salvation if we have no concept of sin? Who needs forgiveness if guilt is only a subjective feeling that you can, of course, overcome with some self-coaching or coaching? After all, who needs God in this world if it is nothing but material and if it's nothing but the result of blind chance? If we speak into this cultural moment by just emphasizing the importance of Christian key ideas about life, it is like telling a colorblind person why yellow is so beautiful. It just won't spur his interest, it won't speak to his desire, and it just won't have any significance. So, as always, it's interesting to look how the gospel, how the Bible deals with that, and this is a very common situation in the Bible. And let's look at what the gospel teaches us about that. After all, we are neither the only ones nor the first ones who are facing this situation. Let's have a quick look at how John talks about this in his gospel. So when John speaks to the Greek population, the Greek audience he addressed, he speaks of the Logos. He speaks to an audience that thought in certain philosophical terms. Greek philosophy, but also Roman law, but first of all, Greek philosophy, used the term logos to describe a philosophical understanding of the world. John, and also later Peter and Paul and the other apostles, speak in the language of their audience, using key concepts, but giving them a much fuller meaning. The Stoics, but also Aristotle and Plato, used logos to describe the true God insofar as they could grasp him with human reason alone and, of course, without revelation. And, of course, they understood a great deal of it. The animating principle, the unmoved mover, the root cause of this world, that all was logos to them. They are in no contradiction with Christian and Jewish, by the way, worldview on this, but their understanding was incomplete and misses out, of course, on the personal nature of God. For the Greeks, God, of course, was impersonal, an impersonal principle. For Jews and Christians, God was someone. This is the incredible news that John is giving them and that he's writing about. This God that you, Greek philosophers, describe with your logos, with your understanding of logos, is the God who reveals himself as a father, who takes on flesh, who suffers, and who saves us. That, of course, would have never been even audible for them had he not started to speak to them in the terms they could understand, and then lead it to a fuller meaning, lead the whole idea to its fullness, really. So what does he do here? He appeals to their own basic concepts of their worldview to find a foothold in their understanding for the fullness of the message, for the biblical message. And we are in many ways today in a similar situation as the first century Christians. Some decades ago, most people actually knew the scriptures. They were maybe not following them, but they knew it, right? I mean, so many expressions come from the scriptures, analogies. It's really part of our common language. And some decades ago, this was a common language indeed. People it had meaning for people, independently of their personal lifestyle. Today, many people are totally and completely unfamiliar with even basic biblical teaching. And we must find ways to engage those who think like the Greeks did in the first century. We must follow that great lesson that we can learn from the gospel for addressing pagan culture. We need to learn to frame answers to people's questions they can understand. Just like imagine a foreign missionary going abroad, and that has obviously been the case for 2,000 years of church history. Foreign missionaries going abroad to countries who were not only speaking a different language, but thinking in different terms. You know, even literal translation of a word does not necessarily make sense in a different language. And so they learned their language, they learned their way of thinking in order to explain the good news to them in a way that they could understand. And so, just like those missionaries, who thankfully still exist today, of course, we are in a way a bit aliens in our own land. We are worldview missionaries in a post-Christian, post-modernist culture. Christianity really has a strong case to make when it comes to worldview. In fact, it really is, as I already said, the only one that can explain all aspects and dimensions of reality. And people will listen to it when we explain it to them in terms of the questions they have. But it also means to challenge, of course, the presuppositions, the concepts, etc. they have. So I think what we really need today is a discipleship of the mind. We need to include intellectual evangelization of our own mind, intellectual evangelism in our pastoral strategies, if that's maybe not the most ideal word, but in how the church wants to reach out to this culture. We need to include discipleship of the mind. We cannot just have discipleship of the heart because it will be totally irrelevant for people. It will be your private business and your private entertainment, but that's it. So one of the great challenges, I think, today is how can we develop Christian minds? How can we think Christianly about this world? And not just about our Sunday Mass, but about every square millimeter of this existence. What does this mean for our cultural moment in this our cultural mandate, in this moment? I think it means the following. It means, or what are the priorities, let's say? We have to proclaim the goodness of creation. You will be surprised once you engage discussions with people about this, how many people think that it's actually basically inherently in its nature bad. Our world, what we have out there, what we see, the human being, etc. I think we have to start at the beginning, and the beginning hasn't changed. It is good. This creation is good. God wanted something good, and he made it good, and this has not changed. We have to understand where evil comes from, and that no system, no powerful government, as well-intended as it may be, no poverty eradication program, not even good laws. And I say this working for a legal organization, and we are engaging in the legal world to have better laws, because that is a very important part of how our society lives together and is structured, and of the ideas we hold dear. But nothing of that, and not even good laws, will be able to erase sin from the human heart. And we have to understand this. And it is a key to understanding what is going on in this world today. And then, I think last but not least, always ask yourself the four following questions. What is out there in our cultural moment of today? What is good that you can promote and protect? Christians have always been known through the history, and especially when the culture was not really agreeing to their terms and to their thinking. They have always been known for not just having some ideas about this world, but doing the right thing. Not just being against infanticide, but picking up the child that was lying in the street. So what is actually good, if you see something good, then promote it and protect it. Secondly, what is missing that you can contribute? Building up a culture of life in the wide sense. I'm not only talking about pro-life questions, but of course they are crucially important. Build it up wherever you can. When you are contributing what is missing in our current culture, you are actually extending God's creative work in this world. And that is really, in the wide sense, that is, invent something that the world needs. Offer a service that is not there. Create a good policy. That is contributing that something that is missing. So in that sense, of course, it makes a lot of sense to engage at all levels in society, including at the legal and policy and political world. What is evil that you can resist, and what is broken that you can restore? And I think, what is evil that you can resist is one of the 4 questions that you have to ask yourself if you want to understand what's your role, your calling, your purpose in this moment. And so many Christians today shy away from difficult questions. Yes, undoubtedly, it's not easy, but it really never has been so easy to be a convinced Christian and to really, be a worldview missionary. But so many Christians think, oh my God, I don't want to be always against something and see all this evil out there that we have to resist. I want something positive. Yes, you're right. You're right. But you have to see these 4 questions they are equally important. It's not one over the other. What is good, promote it. But what is evil, resist it. If you're faced with evil, the greatest service you can do to your community, to your family, to your own personal salvation, I think, is to resist it. But it's one of the 4 questions. It's not the only one, by no means. And luckily, we see so many Christians engaged in all 4, of course. So if you apply these 4 questions to our moment, understanding it from the great story as a precise point in the story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, I can assure you that you will neither be bored in your life nor fall into despair, but you will lead a life of courage, of strength, and of joy. You will put your life at the service of God and of your community and extend His creative work in this world. And you will live as someone telling the story to those who only see the moment. And I believe that this is our mission today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you can take a seat and rest for a little while. I encourage everyone to think of a question they would want to ask, either via Slido or here. I will take the privilege of a host to ask a question or two, and then I will turn to the audience via Slido or even here who wants to pose a question. I think there will be an assistant with a microphone. But thank you, Sophia. It was very inspiring. For some reason, it really stuck with me that the Bible never concerned itself with atheism, but with idolatry, and I think it tells a lot about human condition. But I would like to take a very personal twist here, because I know for a fact that you weren't always a Catholic, you weren't always a Christian, and so I would invite you to tell us a bit more about your conversion and perhaps how it fell or how it falls into your analysis that you have proposed.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, when you have a conversion in your life, everything changes. I mean, when I say no square millimeter is exempt from that, it is because that's my experience. It is also what I then worked through intellectually, but it is first and foremost my experience. And I come from a family that has, you know, two parents, originally Christian, but Catholic and Protestant, but had nothing to do anymore with the church. And so we were not baptized, and we grew up with a lot of common sense and with a lot of opening to sort of the spiritual world. There was a clear understanding that something bigger exists. It wasn't just a materialistic, atheistic household at all. But it was very vague and certainly not Christian. And through, I mean, there's lots to say about this topic, but maybe to pick a few points out of this. I guess that it all started, I mean, being open really to something that goes so much beyond our control started certainly with some family difficulties. My parents divorced. My mother then found Christ after, just literally out of this experience. And, you know, often I think that is a certain pattern that we see, that people really open up to something bigger than themselves, or let's say to the true God, because my parents were open to something bigger than themselves, but it was all sorts of, you know, Indian healers and I don't know what else, when you are experiencing suffering. So I think in that sense, it's actually not such an unusual story, but of course it's just an amazing grace that this happened. It could not have happened. And so some years later, I had a really, basically a St. Paul conversion in 2 seconds in a Eucharist, where I ended up, not by chance, I would say, of course, but because someone invited me. And you know, you can have all sorts of ways to God. I mean, I saw one of my brothers who had a much more sort of intellectual way closer to the faith, to somehow you know, understand little by little that this all actually makes sense. And he needed this personal conversion, and that came much later. For me, that was the starting point. And then the whole working through all these questions and so on only started, but with that experience, which I just, you know, there's no doubt that it was real. And so I just met God face to face in the Eucharist. But so one thing that is really interesting and important for me even today is that I can relate so well to this deep desire in the human heart that longs for something. It longs for meaning. It longs for, you know, St. Augustine describes this as, I'm longing for my homeland, but I don't know where it is. And that's, I think, the experience that I made. I was 17, almost 18, when I had my conversion, and that longing for your homeland, but you actually don't know where it is and how to even describe it. But the longing is there. And so you know, I feel kind of both. I feel the tragedy of people who don't find an answer to this, because it is tragic. It can ultimately, I think, only lead you to apathy or to despair, really. Yeah, at least when the fun is over at some point in your life. And on the other hand, you know, it sort of produces a very hopeful view on what is possible in this culture, because that longing, of course, hasn't stopped at all. It's just us who have to find a way to speak to that, you know, and not to come with sort of abstract theological or other concepts that are important when you want to study the subject, but you know, it's like 2 different worlds. And so I think that longing is, of course, there. Plus, God is almighty, right? I mean, that is a very precious experience. If you once in your life experience that your life can literally change within 2 seconds, nothing is impossible.
But where do we fail in this as Christians? Because, as you said, the question of suffering is a very important one, existential one, and we believe that we have the right answer, that we possess this gift that we can offer to the people who long for meaning in their suffering as well. But it seems that for one reason or another, to many people, this answer, this gift, either hasn't been presented to or accepted by them. So where would you say we fail in presenting this gift?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, it's not by coincidence that in our time, so people do, not everyone of course, but people do sort of move away from faith often when they go through a really difficult situation. And this is, of course, the problem is not what do they do with their faith once they are in a difficult situation. The problem is from before. What was faith ever to them? If it sort of fails to give you real answers and carry you through once things are really difficult. So I think the problem was more, well, what was your understanding of God before? What was your understanding of like all the theological truths we believe in? But of course, the contrary is also true, namely that when people experience concrete suffering, as I just said with the example of my own family, it also can bring people, of course, closer to God. And I think one problem in a way that we have today is that from a Christian point of view, yes, we have a theological answer to this. We can make sense of it. But we are maybe sometimes or often too quick to just give a theological answer to this. And I recently read a fantastic essay by Benedict XVI in a book that I only know the German title. It's Zur Freiheit befreit, it's called the book. So freed for freedom. I don't know if that's the right translation, but anyways, he writes about suffering and the whole Theodicee problem. And he really says, well, we can not just be done with the problem. The problem of the church and of Christians today, and that's Benedict XVI, is that we are too easily done with the problem. So either we say, okay, some people often say, of course, that is incompatible with a good God, suffering and a good God that doesn't go together. So we are done with the problem by concluding there is no God, that it's all, it's not consistent. Or, and he says that's equally problematic, we are done with the problem by having a quick explanation. By just saying, oh, you're suffering, you're having this terrible situation, this all fits in like this and like that. And what he basically says is, in suffering, there is a point where you can just endure with the other person as well. And we're never done with that situation, never. And there's something where you can just be and accept it and accept the lack of why, the side of like a mysterious side of why this happens to you now and in that way and so on. And I found that very encouraging because it's a very humane face or approach to it. I say, well, you can never just be done with the question of suffering. And that is coming from probably the greatest theologian of the 20th century.
Do we have a question from the audience? Is there a microphone? Yes, there is. Over there. So if we have a question, we can take one from the audience and then we'll turn to Slido. Is there anyone? Máme tu niekoho, kto by sa opýtal otázku? Vzadu.
Now we see that there are actually some people in this room.
Good evening. Thank you for your insightful talk, Sophia. If I may ask just one question, you spoke a lot about the intellectual dimension of life, how it's important, you used the word, so to speak, how we need to evangelize the minds, the intellect these days, and approach the intellect in the state as it is in today's culture. But my question for you is, as an intellectual yourself, how do you kind of keep the intellectual dimension of life kind of in check in a healthy respect? How do you not over-intellectualize things? Of course, it's important, you know, to think about the role of prayer in life. It's also important to think about, you know, just liking people, just being in a relationship with them, just not, so to speak, overpowering with them with all the truths that we as Christians have. So how do you keep the intellectual in check, in balance? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm by no means arguing for sort of intellectual faith alone. And I actually find it quite a nuisance when I meet Christians who just are so quick to explain everything, and they have always the great answers, and they know the catechism absolutely by heart. And that's great. Nothing against that. But that's obviously not, I mean, that's not what I'm arguing for, and that's would never be enough. However, if you just think of what is the, you know, what is the challenge of our current culture, you have that sort of very small group that really knows a lot about faith, and that can be a little bit pedantic, and it can be at the cost of real human depth and experience and accepting, as I just said, for suffering. The same is true for so many other things in life, accepting that there's something that really goes beyond your understanding. So, you know, that brings a certain humility to even to your thinking about faith, to say, well, you know, ultimately, we know very little, but of course we can know something, and we have revelation. So, you know, if that human depth is lacking, or if it's sort of your thinking about your faith leads to a sort of hubris, right? You know, I'm really the better Christian because I understood things. That would just be totally the wrong way. So that's by no means what I would propose. And so, but if you think like those who really study, take time, know the faith really well today, I'm not talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago, today, and those who have, like, who think, okay, the Christians who think, okay, my faith is Sunday at Mass, my personal relationship with Jesus, I think that's the much greater challenge. The much greater challenge. And so, in terms of sheer numbers, I think there's such an imbalance, right? So I think we can, certainly we need to develop the right posture, but I think that the real challenge at a large scale in the West is how can we form Christian minds? And a Christian mind is not over-intellectualizing faith. A Christian mind is, how can I live, experience faith without reducing it to only the personal dimension? Because we really get something wrong if we do that. And so, you know, this is not intellectualizing it, but it is sort of understanding the breadth and the depth and the width of our faith, and really learning and studying how this applies to all these different realities of our life. Now, this is, by the way, not just someone who has a doctorate or even a university degree. I think this is really for everyone. And I think the church has to teach it, and we all have to teach it at all levels of society. And I think that this broad dimension of Christianity as a worldview that goes beyond just me and my personal savior is accessible to everyone, no matter how simple you are, and actually a simple mind can understand a lot, and maybe more than someone who is over-intellectualizing. So absolutely, I mean, that's by no means and it's a good question, because it's a good clarification as well. It really, if it doesn't lead to a deeper experience, to, you know, you basically see if someone is on the right track when things get difficult. Then you really see, is that person really on the right track? How do they live that situation? And I think over-intellectualizing is in a way a little bit of a problem of a very wealthy society. You know, we don't really have problems, so we can over-intellectualize. Well, if you live in a war zone and you risk your life when you go to Mass on Sundays, you probably don't really over-intellectualize anymore. But, of course, understanding your faith well can help you to actually still go to Mass and not abandon it in these situations.
There's a related question to that. You mentioned that we need to look at Christianity not as a personal belief, but an objective fact. A lot of Christians seem to make this mistake of reducing to a personal belief. How can we convince them to change their view? You have already addressed this issue that we need to do that. What do you think, or what's your most personal, the strongest conviction that makes you believe that it's objective fact and not something that I just need to keep to myself?
I mean, you can, of course, a part is really looking what is going on in our societies and seeing if, you know, if you don't live how a Christian worldview would offer, what it leads to. And, you know, take marriage. Christianity has always said, look, you know, it's one man and one woman and it's exclusive and it's for life. Well, when you give that up, then of course, you know, where's the limit of changing that? Like, where's the limit on, okay, you know, duration, exclusivity, number of partners, gender of the partner, etc. Like, I mean, there's basically no limit anymore. So you can, you know, go in all these directions. What we see just sociologically really is that it leads to massive family breakdown and that broken marriages lead to terrible outcomes for children. And that is not because the parents were necessarily bad persons. And that is not also to say that a child doesn't have any chance in life. Of course, it's never, like, we're never totally predetermined by circumstances, by anything. But you have sociological evidence that it overwhelmingly disadvantages children who grow up in broken families, overwhelmingly and at all levels. So, you know, that is just one example where you can say, okay, let's look in society and see what is going on there, and what does Christianity propose is often quite contrary to what produces a lot of suffering and bad outcome. And of course, you know, Christianity has been abused in all sorts of directions in history, so I don't want to glorify anything here. But if you take the message really, don't take abuse, don't take political instrumentalization and so on, but take what do we actually really believe, how we should live, and how we should live as image bearers of God with that unique dignity he gave us. So, yeah, I think you can just look around and analyze a little bit what goes on and compare it against the Christian worldview. And what I said, you know, you have to ask, like, where do we come from? What's the problem, and how can we fix it? And what is the world proposing on all sorts of different problems, and what is a Christian worldview proposing? And then just use your mind and compare and honestly judge yourself. So I think that debate really to look at, I mean, it's so heated up, it's often so controversial and so on, that it's even for Christians, it's becoming really difficult to really struggle through these issues and really say, okay, you know, let's wrestle with it and let's debate it and let's try to really understand. And if there are places where you can have those debates without putting labels on each other right away, oh, you think like this, so you must be like this. You think like this, so you're excluded from the debate. You know, like, there are so many mortal sins you can commit just by debating. If you can create spaces and find spaces and cultivate those spaces where you can have these sort of debates and discussions, I think that is some of the, I mean, one of the most important services we can actually render to even to evangelization and to, you know, to people just thinking these things through and then come to a conclusion about what Christianity proposes is actually not such a bad thing for how we can live well.
We do have an interesting question rather about Christianity living together with other faiths. What do you think about the example of Alexander Tugel.
Tugel.
You probably know who it is, or the.
He's from Vienna, yeah.
Yes, yes. So the infamous throwing of the statue of Pachamama in the Tiber. Can you take a position on that, or?
Well, I will certainly not take a position on a person who did in his good conscience what he did. So I think it's not up to me to take a position on that. The question is, I think the coexistence of Christianity with other faiths, right? I mean, what I can say about the situation is that it is very different. So one situation is can Christianity coexist, and what's maybe the specific mission of Christianity in a world that maybe shares majoritarily different views. And in this other situation, what if the church invites those very different views, and indeed, one could argue, as he did, different gods into the very church? That I think these are very fundamentally different situations. And I would say that second one is, of course, raises some problems indeed. The first one, though, is one where Christians have always, and still today in so many parts of the world, sort of, lived out something that is generally Christian, which is, something that comes to mind is I traveled in the Middle East, when ISIS was still around in Iraq, and they were still in the country, but, sort of expelled and pushed back a bit. And I traveled to those places in the Nineveh plains where literally 10 days before ISIS was still there. And then they were pushed out. So I saw it literally in the way they left it. And so the very first Christians were coming back, sort of looking if their house is still there and so on. And I talked to those people, and they, the way they were always a minority. In the Nineveh plains, they were actually quite a majority, but in the country as such, they are a tiny minority. And the way they sort of build bridges between other groups, even the Muslims among themselves, the Shiites and the Sunnis and all these other groups, there are many other ethnic and religious groups in the country, how they sort of, the only way they could speak to each other was actually through the Christians. And how, in Karakosh, a city of 50,000 people, I think they were like, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but like something like 70% of the teachers of the country, of the entire country at university and high school level, were from that city, which was the Christian city in Iraq. So how is it, that Christians in that situation engage with and for those who don't believe the same thing? I think that is a freedom and a strength that is quite extraordinary and is something genuinely Christian. So I think coexisting with other culture is one thing. Inviting that into our faith, into our church, is a completely different and I think much more problematic situation.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one last question, and it's not upvoted, but I like it because it's about Adf International, and there are actually two questions. So the first one would be, how does one survive working in the Brussels bureaucracy, even as a Christian lobbyist? That would be the first one, and perhaps related or unrelated. What's your favorite thing about working with Adf International?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked very often. How can you possibly survive in this world? Like, you deal with all these difficult issues all the time. Is it not? And so, people sometimes imagine like this really grim work environment, and we are all actually pretty depressed or even very hard, and like we are all sort of militantly keeping up with it. I can assure you that were that, I would not be there. I would have gone. Because first of all, I think it's absolutely wrong. That posture is not the only alternative we have. And secondly, I think that you can't really do this for long. You would just burn out and leave. And I have enough examples in my life, although I'm not at the end of it yet, hopefully, where people literally left that world and moved to something totally different. I don't know, renting sailboats or sailing boats. And I mean, no judgment on this, but what I observe is someone on fire for this mission and for, those big questions in our culture today, suddenly leaving and doing something totally private, withdrawing altogether from it, that is not normal. If that is really a mission we have, and I'm not wanting to I don't want to tell anyone what he should work or what, but it is a strange phenomenon. So I think we have to really think about how our attitude and our posture of what is our role in this. And we only can get this right if we have an idea of the greater story and the moment we are placed in, really. Because otherwise we would just despair with everything we lose, with every bad law that is passed again. After a while you just despair. When you understand this from the great story and really, how does that fit in the much wider story of, through the Bible, of so much in worldly categories, failure. There is just so much failure in this. And through it, God realizes his plan. And there's also victory. And especially there will be ultimate victory. So I think, taking a good and healthy distance to it, not because we think it's not important or it has no relevance, absolutely not, but because we are able to tie it into the bigger story, is for me an absolute necessary element. And it's something you can cultivate, and I totally see the temptation to sort of get into I was there personally, I can tell you I was there, and I was almost burnt out. That was before I worked for Adf International. But I know that situation, and I think it's a temptation for everyone today to sort of, ultimately think that if we don't save the world, it will be lost. And then, you suddenly start to realize, oh, actually the world is saved and not by me. But, we are still in all this struggle. And so what's my place in this now? But you can do this with a lot more of sort of, I don't want to say, peace of heart and peace of mind. Despite the struggle, despite failures and victories, you just can do this. And so is it hard? No, it's not. It's a difficult mission, certainly. I'm constantly challenged by my work. But is it sort of weighing on me constantly? Is it like sort of pulling me down in my, personally? No, on the contrary. Absolutely not. But it's something we really cultivate as a team. I think there's sort of very intentional cultivation of that attitude, because otherwise, people would just do this for 2-3 years and then go. So, did I answer both questions?
I think so. What's your favorite thing about working with Adf International? But
let me just say a last sentence to this. I think besides an incredibly interesting mission, raising up a new generation that wants to engage in for society, in politics, in law, etc., at all really culture-shaping institutions of society, that's an incredibly interesting work. But besides that, I think it is, to sort of work with others, and together we go deeper and deeper. And again, it's like with suffering, we are never done with it. But we really are on a trajectory together of being faithful and being in servant leadership, really, taking the lead, but serving, and being in there, knowing that there will be attacks, there is hostility, and it doesn't lead us to a sort of hardness or hardness of heart, hardness of mind as well. But it leads to, your faithfulness is tested and your courage is tested. No doubt about that. But to do that with colleagues and, to cultivate that sort of environment is probably my favorite thing about ADF.
I'm not sure if you recall the quote by Senator Ronan Mullen from Arete Academy. I think he said something like, those who are carrying heavy burdens need a light heart. Mm-hmm. And it became kind of a quote of the week. So I think it does tie into that. And I would really like to thank you for this evening. It has been a pleasure for me personally, but I believe also for all the present virtually and physically. There has been a lot to unpack that you attempted, and I think did successfully. And we really wish you all the best for your service, for your mission, for your life with Christ. And if you're interested in some of the materials or resources that Adf International has to offer, you can find some in the shop outside of the theater, I think, or outside of this hall. And
it's all for free, though.
It's all for free. That's also good about Adf International. It's all for free. And is there a kind of a closing thing Jay has to say? Okay.
Je tu closing thing, ktorú Jay chce povedať. A možno v prvom rade by sme mohli veľkým potleskom v tejto sále poďakovať našej hostke, Sofia Kuby. Zároveň veľmi pekne ďakujem moderátorovi dnešného podujatia, Jánu Tomaštíkovi. Veľmi pekne ďakujeme, boli to inšpiratívne slova, ja som sa tiež veľmi tešil, aj keď som tu počúval iba chvíľku. Priatelia, pre vás niekoľko oznamov. Chcem vás v prvom rade pozvať, aby ste neodchádzali, ak teda nič dôležitejšie nemáte dnes na práci, aby ste ostali spolu s nami aj na ďalšie podujatie, ktoré nás čaká, to druhé dnešný večer. Začína sa o 8 hodine, možno s maličkým posunom, pretože sme krátko predĺžili toto podujatie, ale určite to nebude dlho trvať. O 8 hodine nás čaká výživná, plnotučná diskusia, proliferská diskusia až so 7 hostiami, ktorých teraz by som chcel v rýchlom slede vymenovať, diskutovať o tom, či môžeme potrat brať ako dogmu. Príde Cyril Vasil, Martina Bednáriková, Anton Chromík, Patrik Daniška, Tomáš Kováčik, Lucia Labásová, ak dobre čítam, a Juraj Šúst. Takže ste veľmi srdečne pozvaní aj na túto diskusiu. Začína o 8 hodine. Podujatie, ktoré sa práve skončilo, tak ako aj všetky ostatné podujatia z dielne BHD, nájdete už dnes a veríme, že už o malú chvíľu dokonca na našom YouTubeovom kanáli, takže si to môžete doma pozrieť alebo rozposlať priateľom, ktorí sa nemohli zúčastniť a môžete ich tak inšpirovať a posunúť ďalej. Chceli by sme poďakovať našim partnerom, vďaka ktorým je toto podujatie možné. Menovite sú to Poľské veľvyslanectvo, Lisina Rožko & Partners, investičná spoločnosť Turbilon, vinárstvo Stevino a Di Bosco káva s hodnotami. Zároveň ďakujeme našim mediálnym partnerom, portálom Nové mesto, Slovo Plus, bezhraničnaláska.sk, týždenníku Týždeň, Rádiu Mária, Rádiu Lumen a Rádiu Devin, a teda celej RTVS. Našimi podporovateľmi sú Zachej, Asociá za život a rodinu a Pochod za život. Takisto im patrí veľká vďaka a symbolicky tá najväčšia vďaka patrí našim hlavným partnerom, ktorými sú spoločnosť Plaut a Fond na podporu umenia. Našim hlavným mediálnym partnerom je konzervatívny denník Postoj. Organizátorom BHD je SLH, Spoločenstvo Ladislava Hanusa, do ktorého sa môžete zapojiť aj vy, napríklad tak, že sa zapíšete do 32. formačno-akademického programu, ktorý je prezenčný, bude sa konať každý týždeň v Bratislave a spočíva v tom, že sa pravidelne na týždňovej báze budete stretávať, čítať zaujímavé texty a diskutovať o nich možno aj v podobnom duchu, ako ste to videli a zažili tu. Všetky informácie a deadline na prihlasovanie, ktorý je teda 4.10., môžete ešte využiť na stránke slh.sk. Keď spomínam webovú stránku, tak chcem spomenúť aj Instagram, spoločenstvo Ladislava Hanusa, ktorý funguje od leta a každý deň sa na ňom objavujú zábery a fotky aj z tohto podujatia. Takže myslím, že keď nájdete SLH aj na Instagrame, tak môžete ho zafollowovať tiež. Chceme vás, milí diváci, ktorí ste nás sledovali doma, osloviť a požiadať o to, ak by ste chceli a mohli, tak prosím, podporte toto podujatie a nás tým, že si zakúpite virtuálnu vstupenku. Dnes je to naozaj možno o to dôležitejšie, keďže zvyčajne plná sála teraz musí zývať, tak povediať, s prázdnotou kvôli súčasnej situácii a obmedzeniam, ktoré táto súčasná situácia so sebou prináša. Takže vy, naši milí diváci, ste vlastne, ak by ste chceli byť aj platiacimi divákmi z pohodlia vašich domov, budeme veľmi vďační a zaistíte tak, že toto podujatie bude môcť pokračovať aj na budúci rok a prinášať ďalších inšpiratívnych a vzácnych hostí. Ak nás podporíte sumou ľubovoľnou, ale ak tá suma bude aspoň nad 1 euro, tak vám vieme aspoň ako vďaku a poďakovanie poskytnúť zľavu u našich partnerov, 10% vo vydavateľstve Postoj a 20% vo vydavateľstve Hesperion. Pomaličky budem končiť, chcem vás všetkých poprosiť, aby ste pokračovali v dodržiavaní bezpečnostných opatrení. Skrátka ROR je tá, ktorú už dobre poznáme, znamená to rúško, ktoré si teda nechajme na ústach a nose, odstup, ktorý od seba dodržiavame aj pri tomto šachovnicovom sedení a ruky, ktoré si dnes večer nebudeme podávať, ak by vám to teda nevadilo. Posledná informácia, nadviažem na to, čo bolo už spomenuté. Ak sa po mojej ľavej, po vašej pravej strane, ak sa vydáte týmito dverami von, hneď pred vami sa objaví obchodík, kde si môžete kúpiť rôzne produkty z našej produkcie. Nájdete tam aj spomínanú brožúrku, môžem povedať knižku? Brožúrku? Spomínané dielo, ktoré už bolo spomínané, takže pokojne sa chodte pozrieť, čo je tam v ponuke a veľmi sa tešíme na všetkých vás, aj doma, aj fyzicky, s ktorými sa uvidíme o malú chvíľku na diskusii s názvom Potrat ako dogma už o 8:00. Pre túto chvíľu vám ďakujem, bolo nám potešením, zatiaľ sa majte.